Welcome to the two-part series on executive function and ADHD. The name of today's presentation is Just the Facts. We're going to be talking about some general information that you need to know to serve children with executive function deficits and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This presentation is brought to you by the Diagnostic Center in Northern California. Just one short word about the Diagnostic Center. We're one of 3 centers in the state of California. Our territory goes from Monterey County up to the Oregon border. We're part of the State Special Schools Division. We provide assessment, training, and technical assistance to schools throughout this area. Our services are free to students who are eligible for special education, and we are serving 351 Northern California school districts. So our territory is broad. A little bit about your presenter today. I've had over 25 years of experience in the public schools as a teacher and diagnostician. I am the parent of a young adult who was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, and I received the honor of being voted the CHAD Educator of the Year. CHAD stands for Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder, and we'll be talking more about that organization as we speak today. The goals of today's training are 1, to define executive function disorder, and also to explain what is ADHD, and to take a look inside the neurology and of the ADHD brain, and finally to discuss the best treatment for kids with ADHD in the classroom. The second part of our training will be oriented around behavioral strategies. This presentation is oriented around general information about ADHD and executive function. Let's take a look at a definition for executive function. I like to use the definition formulated by Russell Barkley, who is a major researcher in this area. Executive function is the use of self-directed actions to choose goals and select and enact and sustain attention towards those goals over time. Executive function, because it is related to how we envision our future, it is a time-based activity. So executive function links our past with our future. Through our executive function, we plan the steps to reach goals that we have envisioned in the present. It's also the basis for social cognition. For you to attend this training, you had to use a large amount of executive function. So first of all, you had to initiate getting yourself to your computer. You had to understand the strategies for using the web-based training. And then you'll need to communicate with your peers afterwards about perhaps what you learned. But social organization requires a great deal of executive function. I wanted to share a famous experiment with you that looks at executive function in children, and that is the marshmallow experiment. The marshmallow experiment was performed back in the 70s and at Stanford University, and it took a look at what happens when young children, age 4, are asked to delay gratification.
chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
So it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? Yeah. You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
So why should this be important to us? The implications for the marshmallow experiment are that kids that are able to delay gratification actually have better life outcomes overall. They have higher SAT scores in school, they do better on their grades, they actually have greater educational attainment, they're more successful in their interpersonal relationships, they have fewer divorces, more intact families, and they're better able to control their eating and their diet, and generally have better health overall. The bottom line is executive function has actually been shown to be a better predictor of school success than IQ. So is executive function affected by the environment? Is it caused by unusual environments, stressful environments, or is it something that we're born with? Actually, we find that it is both. we find that physical and emotional stress has an impact on executive function, and that executive function is finite. For example, when we can hold it together all day in the classroom. As we're teaching, we can be totally organized and focused. But many of us, when we come home, we just want to kick back, watch television, eat potato chips, do all those things that we know maybe we're not supposed to do, but we just want to relax. And that's because our executive function is affected by the stress, and it's the stress that we experience during the day. So knowing this, a group of researchers at Rochester University went back and redid the marshmallow experiment with a few changes to take a look at how the environment might affect executive function.
If I eat 100 marshmallows, I'll be filled up.
Everybody knows that young children, particularly toddlers, 2 to 4-year-olds, are subject to impulsivity. And it has been thought that that is a characteristic that children are born with.
Do you know what? It is snack time now.
And so what we wanted to know is whether or not some of these differences between children can be influenced by their own rational thought processes.
We wanted to manipulate children's beliefs about how reliable the environment that they were in was. We assigned kids to one of two conditions, either the reliable condition or the unreliable condition.
So for the art supplies that you get to use, you actually have a choice. You can either use these crayons right now, or if you can wait for me to go get some from the other room, you can use our big set of art supplies instead.
The kids in the reliable condition, when the experimenter came back into the room, had the better thing. And for the kids in the unreliable condition, the experimenter apologized and said she'd made a mistake. We didn't have that available and then helped them use the first option.
Listen, I'm so sorry, but I actually don't have that big set of art supplies I told you about. Sorry about that. But you can still use these ones to make your project.
A classic example of a task in which children show impulsivity is what's called the marshmallow task.
For your snack, you have a choice. Look what I've got.
Marshmallow.
Yeah, so wait just a second, let me explain. So you can either eat this one marshmallow right now, or if you can wait for me to go get it from the other room, you can have 2 marshmallows instead.
I want 2 marshmallows.
And what we found,
Instead, that's
which was an incredibly large effect, the children who were in the unreliable group were more likely to fairly quickly pick up the marshmallow and eat it. So on average, they waited about 3 minutes.
And did you know I'd not eat this marshmallow?
The children who were in the reliable group waited 4 times longer. So they waited about 12 minutes, which is an incredibly long time for young children to wait before they get a reward.
The differences may be due to a difference in expectations about what's likely to happen in the world. That's what this experiment was designed to address.
Any 3-year-old, self-control is not necessarily at the top of their skill base, but in general, when she sets her mind that she's going to do something, she's going to do it.
In the marshmallow task, I was like, what you want to do is you want to get the most amount of marshmallow possible, but there may be other considerations. Given that I have this one marshmallow now that's guaranteed, what are the chances that if I wait, there's going to be a second marshmallow later?
If it was a teacher he had all the time, that if they would have that trust bond a little bit longer, that he'd probably wait longer.
One of the lines of work that evolved as a result of the marshmallow task was to look at the outcomes of children's behavior later in life. But something that's been missing from the equation is this rational process by which children are accessing information in their environment and making decisions about whether they should behave in the short term or behave in the long term. So if they're in an environment in which long-term gain is very rare, well, then it makes perfect sense for them to behave impulsively, because that's going to maximize their reward.
How's it taste?
Thinking about that second take on the marshmallow experiment, if you remember what the narrator said, if they are in an environment in which long-term gain is very rare, then it makes sense for them to behave impulsively, because that is going to maximize their reward. So actually, when kids are in a situation where they don't know that the reward is, or they're not sure that the reward is going to be forthcoming, then they tend to behave impulsively in order to get what they can get at the time. What this means is in settings where there's a lot of poverty and kids don't trust that if they work towards a goal, they will receive the benefits of that work. We find that kids have more difficulty with focusing on a goal and working towards it, or they tend to take what's in front of them at the time. And chronic stress then is associated with poverty. In fact, what we find that chronic stress associated with poverty actually has a physiological effect on the brain. And we find that the frontal lobe is less developed in kids that have less opportunity to work towards a goal. There's significantly less brain volume in the areas of the brain that are involved with executive function, such as the hippocampus and the amygdala. And we find just a higher incidence of executive function disorders in environments where there is a high level of poverty. Executive function disorders affect several different types of handicapping conditions in different ways. So first of all, in a child with autism, they may have difficulty with fluency of their production. They may have difficulty planning ahead. And they oftentimes, in the classic situation that we often see with autism, have trouble shifting from one activity to another. Making transitions gives them much anxiety because they have trouble putting together how they are going to move from one activity to another. Kids with mood disorders also experience executive function problems. They may have trouble getting started with their work. They have trouble inhibiting their strong feelings and regulating their emotions. Kids with learning disabilities also have difficulty many times with executive function. And the way this comes across for those kids is in monitoring their work, planning ahead, remembering, holding things in their mental countertop space that they need to remember in order to complete an activity, and regulating their emotions. Kids with traumatic brain injury, I didn't list anything in particular, any ways that executive function difficulties are expressed, because it really depends on the type of brain injury that the child experiences. But when we come to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, executive dysfunction is in fact a definition for ADHD. So all kids with ADHD, virtually all kids, have executive function disorder. Several other conditions also involve executive function disorders. That includes Tourette's syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, and oftentimes when kids undergo chemotherapy or radiation treatment for cancer, they may be left with some residual executive function disability.
I want a renaissance to shine a light, be the change we want, set things right. We've been waiting in the dark for so long.
Hi everyone, I'm Amethyst and welcome to Ask an Autistic. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about executive functioning and executive dysfunction. I find it kind of funny that in order to make this video, I had to battle my own executive dysfunction along the way. But I got it now and we're here, so let's get started. You get stuck in the executive dysfunction spiral of kind of feeling of frustration and sometimes even panic because you know what you want to do, but you are unable to get your brain to cooperate and organize itself, pull itself together long enough to actually do the thing. From the outside, or to people who don't know about executive dysfunction, executive functioning issues can and are often interpreted as laziness or being defiant or having a poor work ethic, when really that's not the case at all. Procrastination and executive dysfunction are two totally different things. A person who's procrastinating is able to do what they need to do. They remember that they need to do it, and if they sat down, they would be able to break it down into steps, complete the steps, transition between the tasks. But a person with executive dysfunction, if we even remember what we have to do in the first place, then it's a matter of maybe we can't even transition from what we're doing now. Maybe the task needs to be broken down and we're incapable of doing that. And we can actually have a lot of anxiety and stress because there's something that we know we need to do, or something that we even want to do, like just something fun, but we're unable to get there. It's like running up against a wall in your brain. It's like being stuck in place.
Let's take a look at how executive function affects the brain. There are several areas of the brain that are involved with executive function. First and foremost, we have the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the corpus callosum that facilitates communication between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, the basal ganglia that supports decision making, the cerebellum that's involved with memory and time and movement, and the amygdala, which is involved with how we feel our emotions. These are the the structures and their functions that we just identified. So the prefrontal cortex is the governing structure for all of the areas of the brain that are involved with executive function. I mentioned the corpus callosum and the cerebellum, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which is where the frontal cortex controls the limbic system, and it manages impulse control, reward, and decision making. Well, these areas do not exist statically and independently. They all interact. And so what we're looking at is networks of communication between the areas of the brain that are involved with executive function. Russell Barkley identifies 3 executive networks. The first one, the what network, which is involved with facts and what we hold in mind to guide us with what we're doing. This is a cool network because it's involved with more intellectual tasks. The when network, which we use to monitor how long we're going to need. It's like the timekeeper of our activities. That is also more of a cool network because it involves it helps us regulate our academics and intellectual tasks and our thought processes. And finally, the why network, which we consider the hot network because it's related to motivation and emotions. So let's take a look at how these networks progress and how they work. We have the what network, governed by the prefrontal cortex. That also involves the basal ganglia and decision making. We have the when network, involving the cerebellum and the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, all of these. And finally, we have the why network, which involves the limbic system and in particular the amygdala. The actual, as I mentioned before, the part of the brain that governs all of these systems is the prefrontal cortex, which we can compare to the CEO of the brain. There are many different models for executive functions. Today we're going to be using the model, and in the subsequent training in this series, we will be using the model that is suggested in the brief 2. I chose this model because this is typically the brief 2 is a potential assessment tool that can be used by the school districts in order to assess for executive function. And if school psychologists are using this particular assessment tool, I'm hoping that teachers will be receiving reports from school psychologists that identify the types of executive functions that we'll be talking about today. The brief 2 divides executive function into 3 domains. First of all, cognitive regulation, as I mentioned, which is something of a cool system where it involves initiating and completing tasks, working memory, planning and organizing, monitoring one's task, and organizing materials and thoughts. The behavior domain, which involves inhibiting impulses and self-monitoring of behavior. And finally, the emotional regulation domain, which involves shifting from task to task and basic emotional control. So let's take a look at the individual executive functions that we'll be discussing. Initiation, getting started, inhibiting impulsivity, flexibility in shifting from task to task, and also flexibility in thought process, controlling one's emotions, using working memory, which, as I mentioned before, is the countertop of the brain where we store thoughts in order to operate on those thoughts, monitoring and sustaining attention over time, and finally, organizing and planning both thoughts and activities. We divide these into the hot skills, which are behavioral and emotional regulation, so inhibiting impulsivity, shifting from task to task, monitoring behavior, and engaging in control of the emotions. And the cool skills, which are more involved with academics, starting one's work, being flexible in thinking, using working memory, planning tasks, monitoring and sustaining progress towards goals, and organizing one's thoughts and materials. So how does this relate to ADHD, and what exactly are we talking about when we're using the term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? ADHD is diagnosed using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 5. And in the DSM-5, there are 3 presentations for ADHD. We used to refer to these as 3 types. However, in recognition of the fact that all 3 of these are treated in a similar way, both behaviorally and with medication, the term has been revised to presentations of the same disorder. So the hyperactive and impulsive presentation involves the behavior that we oftentimes think of as typical for children with ADHD. These are the kids that are constantly in motion. They're fidgeting during activities. They get out of their seat without warning. They climb inappropriately. In adults, they constantly have a feeling of restlessness, although they may not actually get out of their seat and run around and climb trees or other objects. They feel like they may want to. They're noisy even during play activities. They oftentimes talk too much. They're unable or uncomfortable staying still. They blurt out in the classroom and in conversations, and they have difficulty waiting for turns, and they oftentimes intrude on the play of others. In the inattentive presentation, on the other hand, these kids may not be so much in motion, but they oftentimes have a lot of careless errors in their work. They're very forgetful. They're easily distracted. These are the kids that live in a fog. They oftentimes seem not to listen. They have trouble with organization. They don't like to be involved in tasks that require mental effort, and they oftentimes lose things needed for tasks. So a child needs to have 6 or more of these characteristics in one or both of these categories to be diagnosed with combined type. They need to have a total of 12, 6 each. The symptoms must be present by age 12 years. Previously, they had to be present by age 7, but the time frame has been moved up to age 12 because oftentimes we don't see symptoms of ADHD severe enough to be diagnosed as a disorder until kids enter junior high school or middle school, where the demands for executive function increase exponentially. Although these are the behaviors that we see on the surface, Chris Ziegler-Dendy, an authority on interventions for kids with ADHD in the classroom and at home, has identified additional characteristics that we often see that are not listed in the DSM. And these are things that we may see on an everyday basis. And in fact, they may be more commonly seen or have more of an impact on the child's functioning than some of the DSM symptoms. What we find for many of these kids is poor reading comprehension. We find fine motor skills are oftentimes affected, leading to poor handwriting, which then has an effect on their motivation to write. We find that these kids process information more slowly than other kids. They are socially immature. They have difficulty organizing their thoughts, and they can oftentimes be very argumentative. Who can diagnose the ADHD? Well, we need to turn to someone who is well trained in using the DSM-5. And that would include pediatricians, psychiatrists, neurologists, licensed clinical social workers, and many psychologists. I often get the question, can school psychologists diagnose ADHD? Well, that really depends on what your district policy is, and also whether that psychologist is trained in using the DSM-5 for assessment. So it really varies depending on the circumstances. And many school districts prefer to have a medical professional diagnose their students with ADHD, but that is changing with the advent of AB 114. So I mentioned a lot about neurobiology because ADHD is a neurobiological condition, but it's also the way that it's manifested is a result of the interaction between neurobiology and the environment. Let's take a look at, we already spoke about executive function and the brain. Let's take a look at some of the differences between the individual with ADHD and the typical individual in terms of neurology and brain. We find that kids with ADHD have less activity in their brain overall than the typical person. So you see here these little red dots are the active areas of the brain while someone is engaged in a given activity. We find that there is less brain activity, most particularly in the frontal lobe, and in some cases more activity in the motor and visual area for the person with ADHD. Recent studies have shown that gray matter, or the number of neurons and cells that we have in our brain, is reduced by 10% for individuals with ADHD. Also, we find that white matter, which is involved with conducting neurotransmitters, grows more slowly in individuals with ADHD. Certain parts of the brain have smaller brain volume, and for many people, there is an inadequate supply of neurotransmitters. Generally, the medications that are prescribed to improve functioning in ADHD target this area. So the medications can't target the size of different areas of the brain, but they can target how information travels. In particular, the main neurotransmitter that's involved with ADHD is dopamine. But when there is one neurotransmitter affected, we often find that other neurotransmitters can also be impeded. So in addition to dopamine, we also find norepinephrine, which is involved with sustaining concentration, sleeping, and anxiety, and serotonin, which is involved with our sleep, our appetite, and our emotions and moods. The individual with ADHD has a brain that does not metabolize glucose as readily as the typical brain. So that is another neurological difference. Let's take a look at the development of ADHD and the cause for ADHD. Heredity is a major factor because ADHD is basically a neurobiological condition. We find that ADHD runs in families. According to Barkley, if a parent has ADHD, the child has more than a 50% chance of also having ADHD. Siblings commonly share the difficulty of ADHD. So if a child has ADHD, his or her brother or sister has about a 32% chance of having ADHD. And in twins, we find there is a 70 to 80% chance that both will have ADHD. What are some of the conditions that can cause this brain condition? Well, we find that birth complications contribute to causing ADHD. Lead poisoning is a big one. Prenatal exposure of the mother to alcohol or tobacco smoke. Again, I mentioned traumatic brain injury early on. And then the side effects for radiation and chemotherapy. Also, seizure medications can cause ADHD as well. However, we know for a fact that although parenting can influence the course of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it does not cause ADHD. Again, the social environment and stressors in the environment can exacerbate ADHD, but they do not cause it. And finally, allergies. Although the child who has untreated allergies can look as if he or she has ADHD, allergies do not cause ADHD. And as soon as the allergies are treated, we find attention improves. Oftentimes, we have thought that perhaps diet might be related to ADHD. Sugar definitely does not cause ADHD. All the research studies have shown that it is the activity that's going on when the sugar is offered to the kids that excites kids so that they have trouble maintaining appropriate behavior. but the actual sugar does not cause hyperactivity. There have been some studies that show that food additives and colors can increase activity in preschoolers, but the specific additives have not been isolated, so it's not very useful information at this time. This map is by parent report. It's important to keep in mind that most individuals with ADHD have other mental health conditions. So kids with ADHD alone only comprise about 30% of the total number of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD. Most individuals have some other conditions such as anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, depression, conduct disorder, or learning disability. The most prevalent learning disability for kids with ADHD is in written language, and the next most prevalent is in mathematics, and the least common is a reading disability or dyslexia. It's important to know that ADHD is not magically cured at puberty, and half to 2/3 of individuals diagnosed in childhood will also experience symptoms as adults. How does that course happen? So as teens, some of the symptoms that we see are that these kids, if they don't receive treatment, they're more likely to experiment with substance abuse. They're more likely than the typical teenager to be involved in a teen pregnancy, and they have 3 to 4 times greater incidence of speeding and auto accidents than other teenagers when they are not treated for ADHD. As adults, they're more likely to have problems on the job. They're more likely to be unemployed, and their general educational level and socioeconomic status tends to be lower than it would be if they did not have ADHD. Sadly, they're 4 times more likely to commit an act of aggression, and they are more likely to have marital difficulties. In 2007, the National Institute of Mental Health did a study of how the ADHD brain develops, and did a composite of many different brains over time in order to compare brain development of this individual with ADHD with that of a healthy person. And what they found was that executive function skills are the last to develop, and that the ADHD brain develops in the same way but at a slower rate than the healthy brain. So taking a look at these two images of the brain, the lightest area are the immature areas, and the darker areas are the areas that are mature. Let's watch how the brain with the person with ADHD and the healthy brain develop over time. So these are the two comparison brains at age 6. Even at age 15, if you compare both brains, there is a much larger area that is less developed in the individual with ADHD than in the healthy individual. This has implications for parents who may be thinking about when their child should drive. Parents might do well to consider that their teen with ADHD might want to learn to drive at a later time than their typical teen. And of course, at least in California, after age 17, driver training is no longer required. So the parent may want to consider later driver training, later time for their teen to get their driver's license, but sometime before driver training is not required. I think it's interesting to note that as kids mature, about 30% of kids will actually catch up by age 30 when the executive functions do fully mature, but that leaves 70% of kids at about that, right, who continue to experience symptoms. Overall, kids with ADHD, because of slower brain development, may experience a 30% developmental lag. And this is primarily in areas such as adaptive skills like motor, self-help, and social skills. These kids, so like for example, your 12-year-old may function more like an 8-year-old in motor development, self-help, and social skills. Your 16-year-old may function more like an 11-year-old. So this is really important for us to keep in mind as we're teaching kids the executive function skills as they go through school. So things like study skills need to be offered for a longer period of time for those kids with ADHD than for your typical student. All right, well, that moves us on into treatment. What types of treatment work for kids with ADHD? I wanted to share with you a little bit about a classic research study that was conducted between 1999 and 2009 entitled the Multimodal Treatment Study. This was done by the National Institute of Mental Health. And basically, there were several university sites where kids received intensive treatment. The students targeted were between the ages of 7 and 9. And they were divided into three treatment groups and one typical community care or control group. So one group of kids received state-of-the-art medication treatment, but just medication treatment. One group received behavioral supports and intervention only, and one group received a combination. The typical community care group just received what they would usually receive without any particular research study, what they would typically receive in their own home communities. And the progress of these kids was evaluated after 14 months. What they found was that after 14 months, which was the short-term follow-up, that a combination of behavioral therapy and medication was most effective. Those kids that received typical care in the community had the least improvement, and that medication alone, when it's carefully adjusted over time, was much more effective than behavior therapy alone or community care. Sadly, not all of the kids in the most effective treatment group were normalized, but about 68% were. Well, the MTA study was followed up over time, and most of those kids that were in the study for 14 months then returned to community care. And the researchers wanted to find out what happened to them in the long run. What they found was that the intensity of that treatment in early childhood did not predict a positive outcome necessarily. Kids that had that were diagnosed with combined presentation ADHD continued to be significantly impaired, particularly as teens, and that intensive treatment that they received early on really would have to continue over a long period of time to be truly effective. They also found that how severe the symptoms were was a predictor of long-term outcome. And also, that those kids that had some socioeconomic advantage and that they had better access to medical care had much better outcomes in the long run as well. So we find that comprehensive treatment is needed, and this would include education about ADHD for the family, for school providers, and for the student. And that's kind of one of the things that we're doing today. It will have an effect on how well your students do if you know something about ADHD. Behavioral therapy is part of a comprehensive treatment plan. Parents and professionals require training to be able to effectively implement behavior strategies. Medication is also effective, and we'll take a moment in a few minutes to talk a little bit about medication, but medication must be monitored over time, and it's not, taking medication is not the only thing in comprehensive treatment. Other things are also important. And finally, educational supports are essential. So 504 plans, tutoring, special education support are all important for treating ADHD. So let's take a little closer look at medication. We find that psychostimulant medication is effective for 70 to 80% of students with ADHD. And we find that psychostimulants are, in fact, safe and effective. They've been used since 1937. We haven't seen any long-term effects in those who have used them over that long period of time. And over 160 double-blind, placebo-controlled studies have looked at long-term effects. They can improve symptoms and thus improve functioning over time. Luckily, those who do take medication tend to attribute their success to their own efforts. So that is another way in which medication is effective. It helps with self-esteem. How does medication for ADHD work? We're going to take a look at psychostimulant medication. There are two types of psychostimulant medication typically used in treating ADHD. That is methylphenidate, or Ritalin, and dextroamphetamine. Those are the two chemical types of medication that are used to treat ADHD. Methylphenidate is offered in many different forms, such as Concerta, Ritalin, Ritalin XR, and dextroamphetamine is also offered in different forms as well. And so let's just take a look at how each of these operates in the brain. This is a diagram that was given to me by Dr. Keith Werner, a neurologist who I communicated with. And this is a diagram of the cell body, or a neuron. And what we see is the axon, the main cell body here, and the synapse, which is a space between two neurons. So generally, neurotransmitters are formulated in the sending cell. They go into the synapse where they are sensed by the receiving cell and then taken back up into the sending cell. Here is a diagram of this two neurons that we just saw. This is the end of the axon, this is the synapse, and this is the receiving area of the receiving cell. So if we look at these areas in the synapse or the sending cell, we find this is where the dopamine and other neurotransmitters are stored. When the individual wants to do something or work towards a goal, move a muscle consciously, the dopamine is released into the synapse between the two neurons. It's sensed, again, as I mentioned before, by the receiving cell, and then it is taken back up into the sending neuron. This is what typically happens in the normal brain. However, in the child with ADHD and the individual with ADHD, we find a significant difference. The area of the brain that takes up the dopamine from the synapse works more efficiently and effectively to suck that dopamine back up more quickly than the typical brain. And so, unfortunately, the neurotransmitter does not remain in the synapse long enough for the message to get across to the receiving cell. Let's take a look at what happens when we introduce medication. The R here stands for Ritalin, and this is the situation that we looked at in the previous slide, where the message is not getting across or transmitted from cell to cell efficiently. But we find here that the methylphenidate or Ritalin blocks the reuptake area of the sending cell so that the dopamine remains in the synapse long enough for the receiving cell to get the message. So as you can see, this is not fully a cure for ADHD because, as I mentioned earlier, there are other parts of the brain, other effects of the brain that are associated with ADHD, such as various areas of the brain that have smaller volume and fewer gray matter cells. But this can truly help to alleviate symptoms. What types of symptoms can medication improve? Well, medication can increase attention, it can reduce impulsivity, and reduce hyperactivity. Oftentimes when a student takes medication, you may find improvement in their handwriting and fine motor coordination. Medications reduce the range of emotional responses, so the intensity of that response is less extreme, making it easier for that student to manage. And finally, it can also reduce sadness and depression that kids often feel when they have ADHD. However, you're not going to see medications automatically improve test scores or teach organizational skills or improve social status, and that's where teachers come in. Even though medications may make the child more available for learning, they still need to be taught these basic skills. So far, we've talked a lot about the DSM-5 and the neurological basis for ADHD and for executive function difficulties. But now we're going to talk about how that translates into how we offer services and how a child is diagnosed under the Education Code of California. Students with ADHD can qualify for special education services as a student with a learning disability, and that can be under the RTI model with successive interventions, or it can be under the discrepancy model if there is a discrepancy between ability and achievement, and oftentimes attention is identified as the attached processing disorder, but there can be another processing disorder also. But the requirement is to have a discrepancy between ability and achievement and to also have a processing disorder. The student can qualify as other health impaired when the ADHD is interfering with their education, or they can be, in severe cases, if they have extreme difficulty with managing their emotions, they can qualify as emotionally disturbed. An additional category where you may find kids with ADHD is under traumatic brain injury, if they have received an actual injury to the brain that's been documented. Kids with ADHD are also eligible under Section 504 of the Civil Rights Act for classroom accommodations. And when a student qualifies for accommodations, it is essential that they be provided. Remember, this is a neurobiological or physical, a brain condition that interferes with that child's classroom participation. And as you can see, little Tyro here, unfortunately, has shorter hands and may not be able to participate as well in the discussion as the other dinosaurs. What should you do if you think a child might have ADHD? Well, one of the things that you can do is to keep records of what you've tried with that child. You can talk with other teachers who may have had this student before and see if your suspicions might be confirmed. Talk with your school psychologist or other support staff, and bring your concerns to your student study team. Well, how should you talk to parents if you suspect a child has ADHD? Do not start by telling the parent of your student that you think her or his child may have ADHD. As teachers, we are not educated in using the DSM-5. We do not qualify as diagnosticians for ADHD. So we don't want to put ourselves on the line or put ourselves in jeopardy by telling parents that we think a student has ADHD. And there have been lawsuits where teachers have found themselves in trouble for making any suggestion that a child has ADHD. So you want to avoid that type of situation at all costs. But you can share some objective information about the student's academic performance, whether they're turning their work in. You can keep track of the number of assignments that student has turned in, whether they're turning in their homework, and share that objective information with parents. That's actually something that parents can do something about as well and help support that student with you. Be sure to communicate care and concern for the child. Sometimes it's easy for us to feel that the student disrupts learning for the other kids in the class or interferes with our teaching, but that's not necessarily the first thing parents want to hear. They want to hear that we have concern for that student. So that's so important that parents know that we care about their child and that's why we're talking with them today. We want to emphasize, as I mentioned, the child's difficulties, not the problems that they cause for us. And in addition, I do want to make a note that it's important for us to share the student's strengths as well as the difficulties with the parents, because we're going to be drawing upon the strengths in order to teach that child. After a child has received a diagnosis, then we may want to share some research-based resources with the family so that they can have some additional information. There are many resources available, both in book form and online. Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder is a wonderful organization that offers in-person support groups as well as online support groups. They offer parent training, which parents oftentimes need to implement behavior strategies at home and to work with you and understand the types of strategies you'll be implementing at school. And if you go to the website, chad.org, you're going to find the National Resource Center on ADHD. which is funded by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and has been a collaborative effort between CHAD and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention over time. At the National Resource Center, you're going to find research-supported fact sheets. So you can actually print these sheets out and share them with families for more information about treatment and about the condition of ADHD. Understood.org is a fantastic resource for parents. If a parent registers at Understood, they receive a parent toolkit. And if they take the online questionnaire, they will receive personalized recommendations on how to support their child. What about us? Well, I wanted to make some suggestions for you for additional study and to go more in depth into this topic. For general background about ADHD, consider consulting Russell Barkley. He has a wonderful book out entitled Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a Handbook for Diagnosis and Treatment. If you're interested in research, that's the place to go. Regarding executive function, Dawson and Gari have a handbook out which defines executive skills in the classroom and includes practical suggestions for intervention, called Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents, a Practical Guide. In addition, I want to invite you to use our PENT website, Positive Environments Network of Trainers. This is an organization sponsored by the diagnostic centers to support positive behavioral interventions. And there are fact sheets at that site about ADHD. There are suggestions for interventions for ADHD as well. PENT sponsors 2 symposiums each year, which are attended by invitation only, but you can access information from those symposiums online at their website. Also, I want to suggest the teacher-to-teacher training that has been created by CHAD. It's available on demand at their website and at the Pepper website. So you go to the chad.org website, training events, and then it will take you to the Pepper website where you can register for the on-demand teacher-to-teacher training course at cost. And for free, please return to the Diagnostic Center, Northern California. There is another training in this series on ADHD and executive function entitled ADHD and Behavioral Strategies. Please visit our website to participate in that training. We also offer Ask a Specialist, and our Facebook page has a discussion about ADHD. And come back to our website periodically. Information will be updated. Please feel free to phone us or contact us in other ways for more information about executive function and ADHD. Thank you so much for participating in today's training. Thank you for your attention. And please accept my highest wishes for your success with your students who have ADHD and executive function disorder.